and identification. So it for some reason, it didn't seem as long as the other ones to me. I don't know, even though it is longer. Okay, the antibody screen, everybody already knows what that is. It's used to detect antibodies. So the screen just tells you if there's one there or not. Antibody screens are used for people that need a transfusion, so if somebody needs a unit of blood, and so they'll do it on pre-op people, so people before surgery. If there's any chance in their procedure that they're gonna need blood, they do them on every pregnant woman. Patients who have had transfusion reactions, so if you start having a transfusion reaction, they'll do another antibody screen as part of the workup, and then blood and plasma donors. So donor centers do antibody screens too. I've never worked in a donor center, so I'm guessing every donor, they'll do a screen on the blood and the plasma. So the antibody screen uses the patient's plasma or serum. We're using plasma is what we're using in the lab. Against reagent red cells to detect unexpected antibodies. So those reagent red cells, the little bottles we used in the screen, so those are the cells which have the antigens on them, and we test the plasma against it to see if there's any antibodies. Unexpected antibodies are a result of red blood cell stimulation. So transfusion, HGFN, so where there's a blood exchange between the mom and the baby. And they may be clinically significant, which is the IgG ones, or not, which is IgM. So only a small percentage of healthy people have red blood cell antibodies because they're not being transfused. So I read in the textbook that between 14 and 50% of chronically transfused people have red blood cell antibodies. And that's just because they're being transfused more often than the healthy people.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Okay, clinically significant antibodies. They're usually IgG. So that's the ones that react at 37 degrees. So when we did the incubator, the heat block, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes some people call it a heat block, a dry bath. It's just something that warms it up to body temperature. And at the AHG phase. So we didn't read for agglutination at 37 degrees. With some enhancement media like Bliss, I think that there is a 37 degree phase where you take it out of the incubator, spin it, read for agglutination. So you're mixing it up. And then you wash it, add the AHG, read it again. With PEG, you don't spin. If you spin PEG after you incubate, you're gonna get a false positive because PEG makes it look junky. And once you use Bliss and then you use PEG, you'll be able to see after you incubate what I'm talking about. So you don't spin PEG. If you spin PEG, you're probably gonna have to start over. Clinically significant antibodies, so you already know this, they're associated with hemolytic transfusion reactions and HGFN. So performing the antibody screen, patient's plasma or serum is incubated with the screening cells. So the incubation part is what's important. So anything that shows up after incubation, that's the clinically significant ones, the IgG ones, the warm ones. And so after incubation, the indirect antiglobulin test is performed using the anti-human globulin reagent, the green stuff. And so really all we're worried about in the antibody screen is, are there any IgG antibodies present? Screening cells, so that's why this one's gonna be easier. This really is a review, so if you didn't understand something before, this is gonna help. And then if you have questions, you have to let me know. So screening cells are single or pooled donor group O cells. Single donor vials offer increased sensitivity. So the ones that we used in the lab yesterday, those are single donor cells. They only use pooled cells at donor centers. If you're doing an antibody screen because you're gonna transfuse blood to somebody, you can only use these. And so your blood bank in the hospital, you're not even gonna know it, but this is what they're ordering. That's all they're gonna order. And so transfusion services use this. And transfusion service is just another name for blood bank. Group O cells are used so that the anti-A and B antibodies don't get in the way. Because if you used a different blood type, say you used B cells and you were testing a patient for their antibodies, everything's gonna be positive because the nature of the ABO antibodies. Screening cells come in sets of 2 or 3 vials. So the book explained what the difference is between the 2 vials and the 3 vials. Most blood banks use 3, so if you wanna read about it, you can. Each vial, which is a donor, which is one donor because they're not pooled, the ones that we're using, so that on your anagram, that's one patient or donor. And there's 18 antigens that are required on at least one of the vials. And these are all the clinically significant ones, which are the ones that are at the top of that anagram I gave you. So I gave you that so you can get familiar with these. And so, if you wanna write on your little paper, so you can get used to looking at these. These are not in the same order as they are on the anagram. If I made this, I would put them in that same order. And so when they name this group, it's just called the NNS group. The little s is in there. What group is this? Lewis.
So you plagiarized this over here?
And the next one over
From the
is
book?
Alana.
Yeah. What group is this? What group is this? Kid. What group is this? Duffy.
Do we just ignore P1 for the sake of class?
I mean,
I have a hard time getting Cal Kid, because I get them backwards.
that's why I want you to write it down as many times as it takes for you to get it in your head.
So maybe you,
Kids like to make jokes.
yeah,
Yeah, so this is called the Just
Or-
Kidding group. They cause, number one cause of delayed hemolytic transfusion reactions. Because the antibodies go away. And so if you don't have a high titer, you're not gonna have a severe reaction. But they are there. So it will decrease the life of the red cells. So typically, the patient doesn't start having a transfusion reaction while they're getting the transfusion. It's when they go home. And so then they start having weird colored urine or symptoms that show that there's some kind of hemolysis going on, a hemolytic episode. That's usually mild because they don't activate complement because it's IgG. And so it's not severe, it's not gonna kill them. But those transfused red cells won't live as long as they normally would have. You know what that is? Okay, just for the sake of practicing, writing it down. Oh, no. It's fine. So let's write down which ones show dosage. Which ones are enhanced by enzymes. Which ones are destroyed. Somebody give me a group that shows dosage. We just talked about one of them. Kid, did you say kid?
I was gonna say it, but yeah.
They're bad about it, really bad. Forgot about the snacks.
Oh,
Can you catch it?
yep.
Woohoo, that was pretty good.
Thanks.
Give me another one. Yes. And so when they name the group, they usually just say NNS. Just remember that little S is in there too. Duffy. So look at the tree, remember it in your head. So a lot of this stuff we're memorizing to take the test. This is the stuff you're gonna need to know at the bench. You're gonna just have to remember that.
That tree, the orange, yeah, go ahead, but I feel like if I look at it again, maybe I'll-
The more we talk about it, the more sense it will make. There's one more, the RHS group, except for which one? Except for D. Yeah, big C, little c, big E, little e. So, the easy way to say it is the RHS except for D, as long as you know which ones are in that group. These almost never, so you know how some of these antibodies can go away over time? Kids want the worst one. These almost never go away. Once you make a D, because it's so immunogenic, you almost never lose it. I have seen it go away in a really old, really sick person, but for most of the time, the D is so strong, it doesn't go away. So which ones are enhanced by enzymes? Kale is not affected by enzymes. It is affected by sulfhydryl reagents, which is DTT is the main one that's in my head, because it's the only one I've ever really heard about in real life. Kid is enhanced. The RHs, except for D, D's not really affected.
Oh,
Enhanced.
is Lewis not enhanced?
It is, I don't really even like talking about Lewis, like why are we even worried about it if it's not clinically significant? It is in that group.
Okay, but not really.
So Lewis, I, and P1, the clinically significant ones, we have enough to worry about already. Let's just worry about these.
So just kid and RH.
I'm cool with this.
Yeah. Let's
Okay.
keep it simple.
Okay.
Like, because these are the ones that are clinically significant. Lewis, I, P1, they're really not. And so let's not even worry about it. And destroyed by enzymes.
Duffy
Ah, okay.
and MN.
Kale is not affected by enzymes
Oh.
at all. So kale, remember kale is the second most immunogenic after D. So kale and D are not really affected by anything because they're just super strong. I haven't seen kales go away very often. They can. The sicker the patient is, if their immune system quits working, then their antibodies can go away. They're not making them because mostly it's like immunocompromised people, really old people. And so your immune system, remember, it does decline when you get old. So they can go away with NS. So these two are not really clinically significant. So if you wanted to use an enzyme panel to get them, if it was showing up at AHG, you want to get it out of the way, you can use an enzyme panel to get rid of it. These are clinically significant. Up. And this is if it doesn't show up at AHG or at body temperature, which it usually doesn't. But if it does, you'll know it at AHG and then you have to respect it. But if it doesn't, then if it goes away, you don't have to worry about it. This one usually does. Why are they in the same group? I don't know. They're just named on where they are on the genes. Everybody get that?
That doesn't sound good at all.
What? The air conditioner? I'm feeling in the new buildings, we won't have those anymore. So on the test, you're gonna have to know which ones are affected by enzymes, which ones are destroyed, like which ones are enhanced, which ones are destroyed. So it may give you a list, which one out of this group is enhanced or which one is destroyed. So just make that chart. So screening cells come with that sheet of paper, which is your anagram. 2 or 3 cells. I've only ever used the 3-cell panel. So one of the things that was different between the 2-cell panel and the 3-cell, or the 2-cell screen and the 3-cell screen, if you look at that one that I gave you, it has 2 D positive cells and 1 that's D negative. In the 2-cell panel screen, both of the cells are D positive. So if the patient has an anti-D, then you can't rule anything out because everything's gonna be positive on the screen because the D is on both cells. So that's kinda weird to me. So here's a screen anagram, and so this is a 2-cell. Both of the cells are positive for D. So if the screen is just to tell you is an antibody there, it doesn't really matter if everything's positive. Oh, another difference in the 3-cell panel. The 3-cell panel has a homozygous cell for Kid and for Duffy. And so remember, they show dosage. And so it does have one cell that's homozygous for JKA. On this 2-cell screen, but it doesn't have one, so these are heterozygous, so it does no homozygous cell for, you don't have to write this down. I just wanna show you what the difference is, because this is the kind of stuff that I didn't understand for real until like yesterday when I read the book. There's no homozygous cell for JKB. So if the kids show dosage so bad, and you have a JKB showing dosage, the kids are bad about not showing up at all if you don't have a homozygous cell. So you definitely can't rule out on them. You could miss it on this one. So that may be why blood banks use the 3-cell, most of them. Because if it doesn't show up, then you don't know it's there. And then for Duffy. So here, this panel does have one homozygous for each, which is good for this screen. But maybe not all of them will. So that's just the difference. You don't have to know that. The auto control, we talked about that. So it tests the patient's serum or plasma with their own red blood cells. So you add the patient's red, so you make your red cell suspension, and then you set up your antibody screen, so you put your plasma in all your tubes, and then you take the patient's plasma and you put 2 drops in a tube. Hey!
Do you have any lab scheduled today?
I was thinking about it.
Just check with me before you do. 'Cause
Sure.
You may still not be able to use those 2 things.
Gotcha.
Just check with me for it. How soon are you thinking?
At least an hour.
Okay, all right, just check with me first.
Thanks. It's raining in the offices. Really nasty water, and they did gram stains last night, so we don't really know, not last night, yesterday afternoon, the freshmen did. So we don't know if that's what's leaking. But there's like a huge garbage can in there catching the, whatever it is,
Wait, in the lab or below the lab?
in our offices.
Oh,
So in the suite, like, it's not in the office, but it's right out, like, right out.
Wait, would that be a second floor problem?
So they went to the 2nd floor and they thought they knew where it was coming from, but nobody was up there, and when we were using the sinks, it happened again. So,
Spooky.
we're not sure.
So what I'm hearing is that we can cancel lab,
So the back sinks is the ones that I've been calling the dirty sinks. So really the only one that they're saying we can use is the clean one. But we'll just have to see.
the one on the side.
Yeah, like at the front. Okay, so the auto control, you take a tube, you put 2 drops of the patient's red cell suspension that you made, 2 drops of their plasma, which is weird, right? Like, what? You're not adding any reagents to it. So you follow it through the whole screen procedure. So that is just an extra tube, you put their stuff in it. So when you get ready to incubate, when you add PEG to your screen tubes, remember before we put them in the incubator, you do the same thing, you treat the auto control the same way. And so usually you'll just label that tube AC, couple of letters of their last name. And then you do everything that you're doing with the screen with that extra tube. So if a lab tech uses an auto control with the screen and it's positive, then you can run a DAT. So the auto control is gonna tell you if you're dealing with an auto antibody. So you don't do usually an auto control with every patient. just when you get a positive screen, because that's a waste of reagents and a waste of time and tubes and most of them are negative, right? So if they don't have an antibody, you don't need an auto control. And so you'll do the screen, and usually they'll just do the auto control when they do the panel. So it saves you some work. So the DAT detects in vivo coding, and the auto control and the DAT can help in determining if the patient's antibodies are directed against the patient's own cells, so that would be an auto antibody, right? Or transfused cells. So if it's against the patient's own cells, that would be an auto antibody. So when we do the lab today, if we get time to do it, I want to do a differential DAT.
Is that for boiling water?
Yeah. It involves washing, so yeah. So I'm spelling out all these words until y'all get used to looking at them. But in the lab, you're gonna say DAT or polyspecific, you're just gonna call polyspecific poly. So you'll learn the lingo. But for your test purposes, they're probably gonna spell the words out. So I want you to get used to looking at it this way. Okay, so what's the next step in the investigation of a positive DAT with poly? So most blood banks start with poly because it's just one reagent, one tube. And then if it's positive, they differentiate. So what's the next step? To differentiate it. So what is in polyspecific? There's two things, right? Because poly means more than one.
IgG.
So anti-IgG, complement, anti-complement. Well, so usually it's written just anti-C3. That's what it's gonna say on the bottle. And that could be B or D or both. You don't need to know that. Anti-C3, which is complement. And so what you would do is differentiate it with monospecific reagents. And so this anti-IgG, since it only has one thing in it, which is anti-IgG, it's monospecific. You're gonna do both at the same time, probably. So the reagent that we used yesterday, the green stuff, that's anti-IgG. And so poly is usually clear, and so you would use the polyspecific. If you get a positive, then you differentiate, and so you'd get 2 more tubes, wash them the same way you did the poly specific tube, and then you would add the anti-IgG, which is the clear stuff, to one tube, and you're gonna have an extra reagent that you're not gonna use all the time in the lab. You use the anti-IgG all the time. The complement reagent, which is gonna just be in a little bitty bottle, it's gonna be half the size usually of the anti-IgG, because you don't use it as much. And so So you'll add 2 drops of that to the other 2, and then spin on both, and look for agglutination. And that tells the doctor, you'll put in the computer, whether it was anti-IgG or anti-complement coating the patient's cells. If this one's positive and they have an IgG antibody, which is what we're looking for in the blood bank, usually, if they've been recently transfused, it means you have to do an elution. So you do an antibody screen, and they have, the antibody is, the DAT tells you that there's in vivo coating. The cells are coated inside of the body. So if the antibodies are stuck to the red cells, you may not detect them in the plasma, because that's what we're using for the antibody screen, right? So there's a procedure called an elution, which we'll talk about at the end of this lecture. We'll take a break in a few minutes before we go that far. So that procedure is done to remove the antibodies off of the red cells and puts them into this liquid called an eluate, and that way you can do another antibody screen on that to see if there was anything that was so tightly bound to the red cells that it didn't pick it up in the antibody screen. Sometimes it's negative, sometimes you find another antibody there. So we'll talk about that in a minute.
So if you get a positive IgG, that means it's in vivo.
But either one means there's in vivo coating.
Positive DAT means it's.
Yeah, a positive DAT. And so, remember, we're looking for antibodies in the plasma when you're doing the antibody screen, but for the DAT, we're looking for it's direct, in vivo coating, like the cells are already coated inside, so we're trying to figure out why. A lot of times this one will be positive if it's like an autoantibody or autoimmune disease. You won't do an elution if it's just complement, but if it's anti-IgG, a lot of times they will.
And that means it's probably allo.
Probably. It's probably an antibody to transfuse cells or something like that. So somebody that's been recently transfused. If the patient's immune system has removed so many of those cells already out of circulation, the DAT could be a false negative. There's nothing you can do about that, but that's just the limitations of the procedure. That's why I want you to read in the technical manual and the package insert, because right now, that doesn't mean anything to you. Y'all probably just want me to shut up. But when you see one in real life and you get to read about it, it's gonna make more sense in your head. So don't stop learning when you leave here. So one of the students last semester, this is off topic, but they were in blood bank at one of the facilities, and they messaged us saying that every time they didn't have active work going on in the blood bank, they went to sit in the break room to study. Don't do that. So if you have they're not gonna wanna see you out with your phone out. If you have something you need to study, print it out on a piece of paper and take it with you. They don't wanna see you with your phone, because they don't know what you're doing. They're automatically gonna assume that you're on Facebook or whatever. So, print your stuff out to study. And then if you're not studying for your test, read the technical manual. That's what they want to see you learning, because they're automatically gonna assume that you're not doing the right thing. If you're not in the blood bank, when something happens, they're not gonna go back and show you again, because they don't have time to do it again. You need to be in there the whole day so you see the workflow, what they're doing. If somebody comes to the window and asks a weird question, then and see how they answer it, that's how you're gonna learn. Answer the phone, not the first day, but maybe after a week, start answering the phone. If they're busy and they'll be like, oh, you probably won't have the answer. But put them on hold, tell somebody what they needed, and if it's a short answer, they'll let you tell them. If it's not, they'll take the phone. Just help them. Don't be scared to answer the phone. I was scared to death. So anyways, the autocontrol of the DAT helps you determine if the antibody is directed against the patient cells or the transfused cells. Potentiators, we already talked about those. So PEG is the one that I have used the most, and that's what we used yesterday. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. The machine that we used at the blood bank where I worked, which was solid phase, uses LIS for every antibody screen and panel. Albumin takes a long time, but it can help not enhance warm autoantibodies, which are a nuisance. So there's advantages and disadvantages to all of those. And enzymes, I mean, I don't really consider that a potentiator, but they fall into this category because it helps you detect some antibodies and some others not. So, you can read this chart in your free time. But it talks about the enzymes and the potentiators. And it gives you some information about the advantages of, and disadvantages of gel versus solid phase. Those are the only two methods that are really being used in automation in blood bank, gel and solid phase. I like solid phase because it's the only experience that I have. Some people that use gel, they love gel. Do y'all need a break? Okay, so get the patient's history. We talked about that already. That's the first thing you're gonna do. As soon as somebody, you're gonna get the history in the beginning already. So you're gonna look to see what's their blood type, have they been here before? Do they have a history of any clinically significant antibodies? So you're gonna do that while their sample's running. Before you even know any answers, you're gonna write down as much information as you can find about that patient. This is the most important thing you're gonna do in the beginning, is get their history. So there may be a question on the test about that. You need a complete medical and transfusion history.
Liz had to deal with that yesterday.
What she do?
She's MRI, and so woman goes in, takes off all of her metal, and like in 5 minutes, she is like screaming that her eyes are burning. And apparently, the permanent eyeshadow tattoo that she has,
Cool.
she got in Guam, and the
Wow.
woman used a metallic ink, and just didn't tell her.
I'm sure that's really bad for you because it gets in your, I'm sure it gets in your blood.
Whatever it is, she got metal in her face. Not great.
Wow,
Yeah, I mean, it's cool, yeah, but,
fascinating.
she's like, oh my God, I'm in pain, my eyes are on fire.
Wow, cool. Okay, so what's one of the main things in the medical history you're gonna need to know? If it's a woman.
Pregnancy.
Pregnancy history. The more pregnancies they've had, the more chance they've had to make an antibody. So, mixed red cell populations from a previous transfusion can remain for up to 3 months. So red cells live 3 months, right? So that makes sense. And so say it was an A patient that came in as an emergency and they got a unit of O blood. Well, when you're doing their forward typing, and you'll see both populations of red cells. So if it stays an A patient, they got an O, and you're doing with their anti-A, well, they react. You have a big button and a red background where there's a bunch of free red cells. That's not normal with the anti-A. Remember, anti-A and anti-B, you expect, really 4+. You should have a solid button every time because it's testing for antigens. That's what's called mixed field. You have a solid button, and then you have some free floating red cells that are not agglutinated at all. So that's a mixed population. I'll try to make a lab with mixed field so you can see it under the microscope, is what I would like to do. Because I didn't get to see that before I went to clinicals. And everybody's talking mixed field, what? So you'll see that with a DAT also, if the patient has been transfused and they're having a transfusion reaction. So the DAT is gonna pick up the IgG coded cells, which is the donor cells, and then their cells will be free floating. So DATs, that's what they look like. You take a DAT to the scope every time. We didn't do it last time because they were so strong, but hopefully we'll make one that you get to scope and see it, practice rolling the tube. So the patient may have come from another hospital. So how are you gonna get that information? Call the hospital. In our blood bank, we had a phone list on the wall. It had all the local hospitals on the list. Providence, Mobile Infirmary, Thomas Hospital, which is across the bay, anywhere in this area that they may have been. If they weren't, so the numbers were on that list. if I called a place that I had never called before, and we even called places in Mississippi too, look, Google their phone number. So usually it's like the volunteers or whatever gonna answer the phone, hey, I need to speak to somebody in the clinical lab, because they may not know how to get you to the blood bank. When you get the lab people, hey, I need to talk to somebody in the blood bank, it's so-and-so from whatever hospital, then they're gonna be like, you're not just somebody off the street, they're gonna send you right to who you need to talk to. Hey, I would like to get a history on this patient, see if they've ever been there before. Or, this patient said that they've been there before, can you see if you have any blood bank history? They're gonna tell you everything that they know. It's not a HIPAA thing at that point, it's a patient care safety thing at that point. They're gonna tell you. If they don't wanna tell you, then you tell your supervisor, hey, they won't talk to me. That is not common. Blood bankers know why you're asking. Don't be scared to call the hospital. Some diseases are associated with antibodies, and so I read in the book, because you know me, I like to know why. So celiac disease, no, lupus, which is an autoimmune disease, and some cancers. So you don't need to know that, I just wanted to know why. So those are really associated with warm autoantibodies. Some antibodies occur at higher frequency than in some races, we talked about that already. So JSVs can happen in sickle cell patients, but not typically in the white population. And not just black people get sickle cell, just so everybody knows that. A lot of people think that it's just black people. It can be, like, I think a Pacific Islander or somebody, there's a lady that does a webinar or something for a PACE credit, which is what you'll do to get maintain your certification. It's usually like an hour-long thing. You have to answer some questions at the end, and then you get this credit towards whatever subject in the lab. So you'll have to have so many blood banks, so many chemistry. So I always found free ones, so I didn't have to pay for it. But she does one on sickle cell because she's a Pacific Islander or something. And so to show awareness that it's not just black people that get sickle cell, there's other races that can get sickle cell. Okay, so you'll learn about the patient's diagnosis, their age, and their race can help in your investigation. Okay, now figuring out what the antibody is. The initial panel is an antibody panel, so the one I showed you yesterday. 10 to 20 cells, the one that we're gonna use is 10. The cells are group O, so that anti-A and B antibodies don't interfere. Each panel cell is antigen type, so that anagram that I gave you, they're numbered 1 through 10. Each one of those lines all the way across is that patient's phenotype. They probably did it with molecular studies. The anagram lists the phenotypes of each panel cell and is used to record and interpret results. I'm going to give you a question that might be on the test. So I'm abbreviating that for antibody screen. Get an antibody screen, that's positive. Well, at the AHG, which is the anti-human globulin base. What is the first thing you're gonna do to investigate? Okay, so you get a positive antibody screen at AHG, which tells you there's a clinically significant antibody there, an IgG antibody. What's the first thing you're gonna do to investigate what it could be? Get the patient's history. That is the most important thing you're gonna do. So if I would try to get some history from the nurse, something that I couldn't find in the chart, or if I couldn't find anything in the chart, because the nurses, sometimes they don't understand the importance of why you need to know.
I think I already know the answer, but are you not allowed to look up their parents' blood groups?
I mean, women, if they get married, their name has changed. It's not gonna,
Not gonna show
there's
up.
not even any point in doing that. I would call the nurse if I couldn't find something in the chart that would give me clues to where they've been or what's wrong with them. You can tell, or you will be able to eventually, when you talk to a nurse, if they're giving you good information or not. If they're too busy to talk to you, you're gonna know it. Or if I wasn't getting good information, and then if it's a really old person, a lot of them come in with delirium, altered mental status. You'll see AMS on their thing, altered mental status. You're automatically gonna know, you're not gonna get good information from them. So, check their chart, ask the nurse if they've been anywhere else, because if they came in with a family member, at least they will be able to tell the nurse, hey, last week they were at Singing River, you might wanna try them. So, fill the nurse out, see if you're getting good information. Ask the nurse, can you trust the patient? Like, are they with it? That's why you should ask them, are they with it? Can they tell us accurate information? If not, just call around. Even if I couldn't get any information at all, like they may come in unconscious, I would still call local hospitals if they had a positive antibody screen to see because if they had never been at my hospital, I knew they had been somewhere if they had an antibody, especially if it was a man, right? So, don't be scared to call. We don't wanna talk on the phone. We're loud people. We don't wanna talk to anybody. Put in the blood bank, you're gonna have to. So the auto control, I'm not gonna stop because we talked about this already. A positive auto control or DAT indicates that an autoantibody or an allo antibody is present to recently transfused cells. A negative auto control tells you it's an allo antibody. So positive auto control, it's an auto antibody. Because remember, when you did the auto control, you used the patient cells, patient's plasma. If that's positive, they have an antibody to their own cells because you didn't add anything else to it. If it's negative, it's an allo antibody, which means they made an antibody through pregnancy or transfusion. Everybody understand that? I've seen a lot of people do antibody IDs and get a panel that was positive across the board that didn't do an auto control, either because nobody ever showed them how to do it, or I don't know why. They didn't know any better. Don't be scared to do an auto control. If you look at your anagram, which is on my desk, there's a place for you to put the reactions for your auto control at the bottom of that anagram. If a positive auto control and there's a negative DAT, it's a false positive. You can repeat it again, maybe wash better. So the phases. IgM antibodies react at room temperature. Everybody knows that by this point. Or during immediate spin, room temperature that's the same thing. And it can show up at immediate spin cross-matching. IgG antibodies usually react at 37 degrees. These are clinically significant. Reactions at different phases may indicate there's an IgM antibody and an IgG. So if you have reactions at immediate spin, when you fill out your reactions on your anagram, which we did yesterday, which wasn't really supposed to happen, but I had reagents that I was playing with, so it did happen, which is not common. Usually it's an IgM antibody and an IgG antibody. And so if these IgM antibodies go away at 37 degrees, then you don't really have to worry about them as long as your cross match is good. Y'all want to take a little break? No? So here's an example with a negative auto control. Patient has an IgG antibody. So this is where you'll put your auto control. Your anagram will have a spot at the bottom to put it. Don't be scared to do it. So This is an antibody with a single specificity, which means there's just one antibody. And so the way you're gonna look at it, so at immediate spin, no reactivity, so it's not a cold. Or not an IgM. 37 degrees. So depending on, they used lists. When we used PEG, we looked for homolysis. They're using lists. Remember I told you spin at 37 degrees with lists and then you wash it? You don't do that with PEG. We're just gonna look at the tubes, look for homolysis. We're gonna wash it 3 or 4 times, add anti-IgD, and then read for an IgG antibody, which is clinically significant. And so you had a reaction here, here, and here. So what you're gonna do is look at this like a puzzle. What matches the pattern? If you have multiple antibodies, it may not fit a pattern. That's not fun. Single antibodies are fun. So, this reactivity means you're reacting with one of these antigens where there's a plus sign. So the plus sign means the antigen is on that cell. The 0 means there's no, like for this one example, there's no E antigen here. So you're not gonna react to something that's not there. So, what reacts with just these cells? So you rule out with the negatives. And so what I would do is start here. You're only gonna rule out with homozygous cells. So D's by itself, it's always homozygous. So I would start with that one. Oh, wrong spot. You rule out on the negative. So where did my sample not react where an antigen is present? So which ones did it not react with? It didn't react with any of these. And so I can rule out D, big C, because it's homozygous. So that's hard to look at when they're not beside each other. When big C is not right beside little c, if I made this myself, I would put them right beside each other. Because it's easier to look at what's homozygous and what's heterozygous. But that's not how the world works. So this one's homozygous because there's no little c. So that means they got 2 big C's. So everybody with me. Big E, you don't worry about it because there's no reactivity. Little e is homozygous because there's no big E. CW is kind of by itself, and it's a low frequency, so it's not common for them to have antibodies. M is homozygous because there's no N. S is homozygous because there's no, little s is homozygous, there's no big S. And so this is how you do it. So this border separates the blood groups, so P1 is by itself. And you're not gonna really worry about P1 anyways. Lewis B, homozygous. Lutheran is homozygous. Kell is homozygous. Duffy is homozygous. Kid shows dosage. Bad. It's probably the worst one. I'm not gonna do anything. I'm not even gonna circle it, I just want you to see it. This one's heterozygous. You can't use it. We just have to skip that one. It's unfortunate. So this is how you do it. C, can't use big C here because there's a little c present also. And the RHs show dosage. I know it's really little on your paper. Lewis does show dosage, I think. We're not worried about Lewis anyways. Duffy shows dosage, and Kidd shows dosage. And so as a rule, most blood banks will say you can't rule out on heterozygous cells no matter what. That way people don't make a mistake, because you're gonna be in a hurry, and you're marking out your stuff on your paper, and then if you miss one, if you miss an antibody, then that's bad. So you rule out with homozygous cells only. Oh, my handwriting's bad. That's what I said. That's what it says. So this is how you do it. And so when we do it on real paper, it's gonna make more sense.
Can we do the one that have a 2+ each pH? It's a 35.
This one or down here?
The third, yeah.
Yeah, so D is good. I can use big E because there's no little e. I can use little c because there's no big C. N because there's no M. Little s because there's no big S. I'll do P1, Lewis, Lutheran B. Lutherans are very uncommon. So even if you can't rule out Lutheran, if your cross match is compatible, then you're gonna assume that there's not one there. Sometimes you can't rule it out because, look, every cell here is negative. Every cell here is positive. So you can rule this one out. You're never gonna rule Lutheran B out. Almost never. If somebody would have told me that, so the first time I was doing an antibody panel in the blood bank when I went to clinicals, I never could rule this one out. Nobody came out and said, you don't have to worry about that one. I guess if I would have read my textbook and really understood what it meant, then I wouldn't have spent so much time. So all they told me, you gotta rule everything, if whatever your antibodies say you think you have a big E, you have to rule out everything else to be able to transfuse. Well, you can't rule that one out. Most of the time, you can't rule this one out. But it's so high frequency that it's not common for you to make antibodies. Nobody explained that to me. So I'm gonna tell you when we do your anagram in class, which ones you don't really have to worry about. If it's there, you're gonna see it on your cross match, right? So that's like your quality control to make sure that your transfusion is gonna be acceptable or compatible. So anyway, we'll talk about the ones you don't have to worry about. What do we know about Kel as far as dosage? It doesn't show dosage. At my lab, this was the only one we could rule out with heterozygous cells. We had to have at least 2. You'll just follow your facility's policy for Kel, because most people are negative for Kel. There's only 3 on this panel. 2 of the 3